A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Shattered Dreams. The scent of jasmine and heartbreak still lingered in the air 3 years later. Ruby Winters stood at her clinic window, watching the first snow of winter dust the streets of Cedar Falls, and tried not to remember the night that destroyed everything she thought she knew about love. 24 now, she had built a life of careful routines and deliberate distances. Her veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, far enough from the Riverside Pack territory that she could pretend the supernatural world didn't exist. Most days, she succeeded. Today wasn't one of those days. The anniversary was tomorrow. 3 years since Mason Hayes, alpha of the Riverside Pack, had stood before 200 witnesses and chosen another woman as his Luna. 3 years since he'd looked right through Ruby as if she were nothing more than air, his voice steady and sure as he'd spoken the words that shattered her world. I choose Victoria Crane as my mate and Luna. Ruby's fingers tightened around her coffee mug, the ceramic warm against her palms. She could still feel the phantom ache in her chest, the place where something vital had been ripped away. The bond she'd thought existed between them had snapped so cleanly that night. She'd wondered if it had ever been real at all. And yet, even shattered bonds leave echoes. Sometimes, in the silence of lonely nights, she could still feel the faintest tug, like a ghost of something that should have been gone forever. Her wolf stirred restlessly beneath her skin, a constant reminder of what she'd lost. Shifters weren't meant to live alone. They thrived in packs, surrounded by family and purpose. Instead, Ruby had spent 3 years in self-imposed exile, treating the pets of humans who had no idea what she truly was. The memory hit her without warning, as it always did on difficult days. She was 17 again, standing in the moonlight behind the pack house with Mason's hands gentle on her face. They'd been talking about the future, about the ceremony that would make him alpha when he turned 21. His thumb had traced her cheekbone with such tenderness that her heart had nearly burst. "When I'm alpha," he'd whispered, his forehead pressed to hers, "everything will be different. Better. I promise." She'd believed him. God, how she'd believed him. The front door chimed, jerking her back to the present. Mrs. Henderson shuffled in with her ancient Persian cat, Mr. Whiskers. The routine was familiar, comforting even. Ruby could lose herself in the simple act of healing, using her instincts for something that mattered without the complicated politics of pack life. "He's been acting strange again," Mrs. Henderson worried, her weathered hands gentle on the cat's fur. "Won't eat, won't play. Just sits by the window looking lost." Ruby's heart clenched. She knew that feeling intimately. "Let's take a look at him." As she examined the elderly cat, her healing instincts hummed to life. It was more than veterinary training that guided her hands. It was something deeper, something that had always set her apart from other Omegas. Her touch could ease pain in ways that medicine couldn't explain, could calm the wildest animals with nothing more than skin-to-skin contact. The gift had manifested early, when she was barely 12. Her mother had called it a blessing from the moon goddess herself, a sign that Ruby was meant for something special. Mason had been fascinated by it, always bringing her injured animals to heal, watching with wonder as her power flowed through her fingertips. "You're incredible," he'd told her once, watching her mend a bird's broken wing. "I've never seen anything like it." Now that same gift felt more like a curse, a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. "He's grieving," Ruby said softly, meeting Mrs. Henderson's worried eyes. "Animals feel loss more deeply than people realize." "Has anything in his environment changed recently?" Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled. "My husband passed last month. Harold always gave Mr. Whiskers his evening treats. I think he's waiting for him to come home." The familiar ache bloomed in Ruby's chest. She understood waiting for someone who would never return. Animals process grief differently than we do. He needs time and extra attention. Try giving him those treats yourself, same time every evening. It will help him understand that care continues, even when everything else has changed. After Mrs. Henderson left with a purring, Mr. Whiskers and specific instructions for grief counseling a cat, Ruby allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. This was her purpose now. Healing the wounded, comforting the lost. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a young Omega in love with her alpha, but it was enough. Her phone buzzed against the counter. The number made her stomach drop. Mason. She stared at the screen until it went dark, then immediately lit up again. Same number. Same name that still made her heart race for all the wrong reasons. Ruby let it go to voicemail. Then curiosity won, as it always did where Mason was concerned. She pressed play, hating herself for the weakness. His voice was exactly as she remembered. Deep, commanding, tinged with an authority that made her wolf want to roll over and submit. But there was something else now, something she'd never heard before. Desperation. Ruby, I know you don't want to hear from me, but there's an emergency. The pack's in trouble. Children are sick, and our healer can't figure out what's wrong. We need your help. Please. I wouldn't ask if there was any other choice. The message ended with silence that stretched longer than words. Ruby set the phone down with shaking hands. An emergency. Children sick. Her pack. Even if she'd been cast out of it by choice and circumstance. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to protect herself from whatever new pain Mason Hayes could inflict. But underneath the fear and old hurt, something else stirred. Purpose. The same drive that made her heal wounded animals, that made her incapable of turning away from suffering. Her wolf whined softly, torn between self-preservation and the bone-deep need to help her people. Ruby closed her eyes and tried to imagine ignoring the call. Tried to picture herself going home to her empty apartment, eating dinner alone while somewhere in the territory she'd grown up in. Pack children might be dying. The image made her physically ill. She couldn't do it. Whatever Mason had done to her heart, whatever Victoria Crane represented in terms of political alliances and perfect Luna material, Ruby couldn't abandon children who might need her healing touch. Her hands were already reaching for her medical bag before she'd fully made the decision. 3 years of exile couldn't erase 21 years of belonging. The Riverside Pack had been her family long before Mason became its alpha, long before she'd been foolish enough to believe in fairy tale endings. She locked the clinic and headed for her car, stomach churning with anticipation and dread. Seeing Mason again would hurt. Seeing him with Victoria would be agony. But if children needed healing, Ruby couldn't live with herself if she stayed away. The drive to Pack territory took 20 minutes through winding mountain roads that grew more familiar with each mile. The forest seemed to welcome her back, pine-scented air flowing through her partially open windows. Her wolf stretched hopefully beneath her skin, recognizing home despite everything that had happened. The pack house loomed ahead through the trees, a sprawling log structure that had housed the Riverside Pack's leadership for 3 generations. Warm light spilled from every window, and the parking area was crowded with vehicles. Whatever the emergency was, it had drawn the entire pack. Ruby sat in her car for a long moment, gathering courage she didn't feel. 3 years ago, she'd worn her mother's silver dress to Mason's choosing ceremony, her hair pinned up with the pearl combs he'd given her for her birthday. She'd stood with the other eligible females, heart pounding with certainty that this was her moment, her destiny. Instead, she'd watched him choose Victoria Crane, a newcomer who'd arrived just months before with a tragic story and political connections that made her the obvious choice for Luna. Ruby had stood there in her beautiful dress, surrounded by 200 witnesses, and felt her heart break so completely, she'd wondered if the sound was audible. Now she was back, wearing scrubs and carrying a medical bag instead of dreams. Then she saw him. Mason Hayes stepped onto the front porch, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. Even from a distance, even after 3 years, her body recognized him instantly. Her wolf stirred, confused and hopeful and hurt all at once. He was still beautiful in that dangerous way that had captivated her since childhood. Black hair that perpetually looked like he'd run his fingers through it. Blue eyes that could cut through pretense and see straight to the truth. Tall enough that she'd always had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Broad enough that she'd felt protected just standing next to him. But there were changes too. New lines around his eyes. A tension in his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried alone. Being alpha had aged him, marked him in ways that made her heart ache despite everything. Mason's head turned, and their eyes met across the distance. Ruby's breath caught. 3 years vanished in an instant, leaving her feeling 18 again and desperately, hopelessly in love with a man who would never choose her. His expression shifted. Surprise, relief, something that might have been regret. He started down the steps toward her, each movement deliberate and controlled. Ruby forced herself to get out of the car. Whatever this was, whatever had driven Mason to call her after 3 years of silence, she would handle it. She would help whoever needed healing and then leave, just as she had before. She wouldn't let herself hope for anything more than that. Not again. Chapter 2. Desperate Hearts. Mason reached Ruby's car before she could change her mind and flee. 3 years had done nothing to diminish the effect she had on him. If anything, distance had sharpened the ache until it felt like a physical wound. She looked older, more guarded, but still beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. Her dark hair was shorter now, falling just past her shoulders in waves that caught the porch light. The scrubs she wore were practical, professional, but they couldn't hide the curves he remembered tracing with desperate hands in stolen moments behind the pack house. Her green eyes held new shadows, pain he'd put there, and the knowledge made his wolf snarl with self-directed fury. Ruby. Her name fell from his lips without permission. Rough with emotion he had no right to feel. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin in that stubborn way he remembered. Where are the children? Straight to business. No warmth, no acknowledgement of what had once existed between them. He deserved that, but it still cut deep. The infirmary. Doc Peterson's been working around the clock, but take me to them. Her voice was clipped, professional. She grabbed her medical bag from the passenger seat, movements sharp with purpose. Mason nodded, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the pack house. He could smell her scent now. Honey and wild flowers with an undertone of antiseptic from her work. His wolf whined, desperate to move closer, to bury his face in her neck and breathe her in until the ache of 3 years apart finally eased. Instead, he kept his distance and tried to find words that might bridge the chasm between them. Ruby, I don't. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the front door. Whatever you want to say, I don't need to hear it. I'm here for the children, nothing else. The dismissal stung, but he pushed through it. I know, and I'm grateful. More than you know. She said nothing, but he caught the slight softening around her eyes before her expression hardened again. The pack house buzzed with activity. Members moved through the hallways with worried efficiency, their scents thick with anxiety and fear. Ruby's arrival sent ripples through the crowd. Some surprised, others relieved, a few openly hostile. She'd left without explanation 3 years ago, abandoning them in their eyes, choosing exile over staying to see her former love with another woman. Mason's jaw tightened as he caught the whispers, the pointed looks. He'd deal with that later. Right now, nothing mattered except getting Ruby to the children who needed her. The infirmary occupied the entire east wing of the pack house. What had once been a simple medical room had been expanded over the years into a fully equipped facility. Ruby paused in the doorway, her professional eye taking in everything. The multiple beds, the medical equipment, the exhausted faces of parents keeping vigil, and the children, 7 of them, ranging in age from 4 to 11. They lay motionless in hospital beds, skin pale and waxy, breathing shallow and labored. IVs dripped steadily into their small arms, but nothing seemed to be helping. Ruby's mask of professional distance cracked. Her hand flew to her mouth, muffling a small sound of distress. How long have they been like this? Her voice was thick with emotion. 3 days, Doc Peterson answered, looking up from a chart with tired eyes. Started with little Emma here. By the next morning, 6 more had the same symptoms: fever, vomiting, then this. He gestured helplessly at the unconscious children. Ruby was already moving, setting her bag down beside the nearest bed. 4-year-old Tommy Morrison lay there, his cherubic face gray and still. She placed her hands on his forehead, and Mason watched her expression shift into something he remembered. The focused intensity she got when her healing abilities kicked in. This isn't natural, she murmured, her hands moving over the child's body with practiced efficiency. Something's wrong. The energy patterns are all off. Mason stepped closer, drawn by the familiar sight of Ruby working. Her healing gift had always fascinated him, the way she could sense things that medical equipment missed. As a child, she'd mended broken wings and soothed frightened animals. As a teenager, she'd saved his life more than once during territorial disputes. "What do you mean?" he asked. Ruby's brow furrowed in concentration. It's like something is actively blocking their natural healing processes. Their bodies want to recover, but there's interference. She looked up at Doc Peterson. "Have you tested for toxins? Plant-based poisons?" "Everything I could think of. All negative." Ruby moved to the next bed, then the next, her hands glowing faintly with the power that made her unique among Omegas. Mason found himself watching her face instead of her work, remembering nights when those same hands had traced his skin with loving reverence, when she'd healed cuts from training sessions with kisses and gentle touches. Mason. Victoria's voice cut through his memories, sharp with displeasure. He turned to see his Luna standing in the doorway, her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes, a stark contrast to Ruby's practical appearance. Victoria's blue eyes were cold as winter as they fixed on Ruby's bent form. "I wasn't aware we were expecting outside help," Victoria said, her tone suggesting she found the idea distasteful. Ruby's hand stilled on young Emma's forehead. Mason saw her shoulders tense, the familiar defensive posture he remembered from childhood, when other pack members had questioned her abilities or her place among them. "The children are dying," Mason said quietly, his voice carrying enough alpha authority to make Victoria's eyes flash. "Ruby has healing abilities that could save them. I'm sure our pack doctor is perfectly capable. Our pack doctor has been trying for 3 days without success." Mason's patience, already stretched thin by worry and guilt, snapped completely. "These are our pack's children, Victoria. If Ruby can help them, we use every resource available." Victoria's mouth tightened, but she said nothing more. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, and Mason could see Ruby's discomfort in the set of her shoulders. "I need quiet to work," Ruby said without looking up. Her voice was steady, professional, but Mason caught the underlying strain. Victoria made a sound of disgust and swept from the room. Mason should have followed, should have smoothed things over with his Luna, maintained pack harmony. Instead, he found himself moving closer to Ruby, drawn by invisible threads he'd never learned to cut. "What do you need?" he asked softly. Ruby glanced at him, and for a moment, her guard dropped. He saw exhaustion there, worry, and something that looked almost like longing before she shuttered her expression again. "Space," she said. "And time." Mason nodded, stepping back to give her room to work. But he didn't leave. Couldn't leave, not when she was here in his territory for the first time in 3 years. Not when her presence made everything in him settle in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Ruby worked systematically through each child, her healing energy flowing in gentle waves. Mason could feel it even from across the room. Warmth and comfort, and the promise of restoration. It was intoxicating, being in the presence of her gift again. "There," she breathed suddenly, and Tommy Morrison's eyes fluttered open. A collective gasp went up from the parents in the room. Tommy blinked owlishly, looking around in confusion before his gaze fixed on his mother. "Mama?" His voice was small, hoarse, but wonderfully alive. Mrs. Morrison burst into tears, gathering her son into her arms. The other parents pressed closer, hope lighting their faces for the first time in days. Ruby swayed slightly, the effort of healing taking its toll. Without thinking, Mason stepped forward, his hand finding her lower back to steady her. The contact sent electricity through him. She was warm and solid and real under his palm. Ruby jerked away from his touch as if burned. "Don't." The word was quiet, but final. Mason dropped his hand, the loss of contact leaving him cold. But Ruby was already moving to the next bed, her professional mask back in place. One by one, she worked through the children, pouring her healing energy into each small body until all 7 were sitting up, asking for water and their parents and wondering what had happened. The infirmary erupted in celebration. Parents wept with relief. Children demanded snacks and explanations, and Doc Peterson shook his head in amazement as he checked vitals that had returned to normal. Through it all, Ruby remained apart, packing her medical bag with mechanical precision. Mason watched her hands shake slightly with exhaustion and wanted nothing more than to hold her, to tell her how incredible she was, how grateful he felt. Instead, he approached cautiously, like she was a wild animal that might flee. "Ruby, thank you. I don't know how to—" "They were poisoned," she interrupted, her voice flat. "Someone gave them wolfsbane extract mixed with something else. Something designed to mask the toxin until it was almost too late." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. Poisoned? Deliberately? Ruby finally looked at him, and her green eyes were hard. "Someone in your pack tried to kill these children, Mason. This wasn't an accident or some mysterious illness. It was attempted murder." The room had gone silent around them, parents and pack members absorbing the horrible truth. Mason felt his wolf surge with protective rage, the need to hunt down whoever had dared harm Pack Young. "Who?" The word came out as a growl. "Who would do such a thing?" Ruby shouldered her bag, avoiding his gaze. "That's for you to figure out. I've done what I came to do." She started for the door, and panic clawed at Mason's chest. She was leaving again. Walking away just like before, and he couldn't bear it. Not again. "Ruby, wait." She paused but didn't turn around. "What?" "Stay, please. We need to talk about—" "There's nothing to talk about." Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight tremor underneath. "You made your choice 3 years ago. Live with it." And then she was gone, leaving Mason standing in a room full of rescued children and the crushing weight of everything he'd lost. Chapter 3. Protected Prey. Ruby's hands shook as she fumbled with her car keys. The emotional toll of seeing Mason again, of healing those children, of feeling the old familiar pull toward the man who'd destroyed her. It was too much. She needed to get home, to the safety of her empty apartment where she could fall apart in private. The key finally turned, and she sank into the driver's seat with relief. Just as she reached for the gear shift, a sharp crack echoed through the parking area. The rear window of the car next to hers exploded in a shower of glass. Ruby's blood turned to ice. That wasn't an accident. Another crack, and her side mirror disintegrated. Someone was shooting at her, at the pack house, at children who'd just recovered from poisoning. She threw herself down across the front seats as another bullet whined overhead, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the front windshield, she could see dark figures moving at the tree line, muzzle flashes winking in the shadows. The forest should have hidden them, but the hunters had chosen their ground well, an open stretch where the trees thinned just enough to give clear lines of sight. It wasn't chance. It was preparation. The pack house erupted into chaos behind her. Shouts of alarm, the sound of doors slamming, the unmistakable growls of shifters preparing to defend their territory. But Ruby was trapped in the open, pinned down by whoever was hunting them. A strong hand grabbed her car door, yanking it open. Ruby gasped, expecting to see a hunter with a weapon. Instead, Mason's face appeared, his blue eyes wild with protective fury. "Move over," he ordered, already pushing into the driver's seat as she scrambled to the passenger side. "Stay down." He gunned the engine, tires squealing as they peeled away from the pack house. More shots rang out behind them, but Mason's reflexes were alpha sharp, weaving between parked cars and using the building for cover. "Who were they?" Ruby gasped, staying low as instructed. "Hunters." Mason's voice was grim, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "They've been hitting isolated shifters for months, but this is the first time they've been bold enough to attack pack territory directly." Ruby's mind raced. The children, the poisoning. It's connected, isn't it? Mason glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "I think so. Someone's been gathering information about the pack, about our weaknesses. They knew exactly when to strike." They drove in tense silence through winding mountain roads, putting distance between themselves and the attack. Ruby watched Mason's profile in the dashboard light, noting the hard line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats. This was the Alpha she remembered from childhood. Protective, dangerous, willing to do anything to keep his people safe. "Where are we going?" she asked, as they turned onto a road she didn't recognize. "Safe house. It's not far." The safe house turned out to be a modest cabin tucked deep in the forest, invisible from any main road. Mason parked behind it, where the car would be hidden from aerial surveillance, and came around to help Ruby out. "Are you hurt?" His hands hovered near her shoulders, not quite touching, but ready to catch her if she fell. "I'm fine," but her voice shook, betraying the lie. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her dizzy and hollow. Mason's jaw tightened. "Ruby, don't." She stepped away from his almost touch, wrapping her arms around herself. "Just don't." He nodded stiffly and led her toward the cabin. The interior was sparse but comfortable. A living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms. It smelled of pine and dust and faintly of Mason himself, as if he'd spent time here recently. "You'll be safe here," he said, checking the locks on the windows. "The hunters can't track us this deep into pack territory." Ruby sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. Why are they targeting shifters with healing abilities? Mason paused in his security check. "What makes you think that's what they're after?" "The wolfsbane poisoning. It wasn't random." Ruby rubbed her temples, pieces of a terrible puzzle falling into place. "Someone wanted to test whether I'd come back to heal pack children. They were counting on my healing instincts being stronger than my desire to stay away." The truth hit Mason like a physical blow. Ruby could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hands clenched into fists. "They used you as bait," he said quietly. "They poisoned children to draw you out. And it worked." Ruby's laugh was bitter. "I walked right into their trap." Mason crossed the room in 3 quick strides, dropping to one knee in front of the couch so they were at eye level. "This isn't your fault, Ruby. None of this is your fault." She looked at him, really looked, and saw something she'd never noticed before. Guilt. Deep, crushing guilt that went beyond tonight's attack. "You've known about the hunters," she said slowly. "For months. That's why you looked so worried when I showed up tonight. That's why you were checking the windows and the locks. You knew I was in danger the moment I set foot on pack territory." Mason's silence was answer enough. "And you called me anyway." Ruby's voice rose. "You knew they were targeting healers, and you still asked me to come. The children were dying because someone wanted to use me as bait, and you played right into their hands." Ruby stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "How could you do that? How could you risk my life without even warning me?" Mason followed her, his own temper flaring. "Because I was desperate. Because 7 children were dying and nothing else mattered. Because He stopped himself, jaw working. "Because you what?" "Because I couldn't let them die knowing you could save them." His voice was raw. "I couldn't live with that knowledge, even if it meant putting you in danger. Even if it meant you'd hate me more than you already do." Ruby stared at him, anger and hurt, and something dangerously close to understanding warring in her chest. "I don't hate you, Mason." The admission seemed to surprise them both. "I should," she continued quietly. "God knows I've tried, but I don't hate you. I hate what you did. I hate what you chose. But I don't hate you." Mason took a step closer, hope flickering in his eyes. "Ruby, don't." She held up a hand. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. 3 years doesn't just disappear because we're both in danger." But even as she said it, Ruby could feel her resolve weakening. Being this close to him, seeing him protective and worried, remembering the boy she'd fallen in love with. It was dangerous territory. Mason seemed to sense her internal struggle. He took another step forward, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I dream about you," he said quietly. "Every night for 3 years. I dream about you, about that night, about what I should have said, should have done differently." Ruby's breath caught. "Mason, stop." "I can't." His voice was raw with emotion. "Not now that you're here. Not when I can finally tell you the truth." "The truth?" Ruby laughed bitterly. "The truth is that you chose her. Victoria Crane. Perfect Luna material with her political connections and her pure bloodline. You chose her over me. I chose wrong." The words came out in a rush. "I chose out of fear and duty and political pressure, and it was the biggest mistake of my life." Ruby's heart clenched, but she forced herself to stay strong. "It's too late for this conversation." "Is it?" Mason moved closer still, and now she could smell his scent. Pine and cedar and the indefinable musk that was purely alpha. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we have all night. The intensity in his eyes made her step backward. But there was nowhere to go. She was trapped between Mason and the window, caught in the pull that had always existed between them. The pack will survive one night without their alpha. Mason's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin. But I won't survive losing you again. Ruby closed her eyes, fighting the urge to lean into his touch. You didn't lose me, Mason. You threw me away. I know. His voice broke on the words, and I've regretted it every day since. When she opened her eyes, he was staring at her with such naked longing that her breath caught. This was dangerous. This was exactly what she'd sworn she wouldn't let happen. But then his thumb traced her lower lip, and all her good intentions crumbled. Ruby. Her name was a prayer on his lips. She was about to respond, was about to make another terrible mistake, when a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. They sprang apart, the spell broken. Mason's hand went immediately to the weapon at his side, his body shifting into protective mode. Stay behind me, he ordered, moving toward the door. But Ruby had caught a familiar scent through the walls. Her blood ran cold. Mason, don't... The door opened to reveal Victoria Crane, her perfect blonde hair windswept, and her blue eyes bright with false concern. Thank God you're safe, Victoria breathed, rushing toward Mason. When I heard about the attack, I was so worried. I had to make sure you were all right. Her gaze slid to Ruby, and for just a moment, something cold and calculating flickered behind the mask of concern. And Ruby, of course. How fortunate that you both escaped unharmed. But as Victoria spoke, Ruby caught something else in her scent, something that made her wolf recoil in recognition. Wolfsbane, faint but unmistakable. Victoria Crane smelled like the poison that had nearly killed 7 children. Chapter 4. Dangerous Truths. Ruby's blood turned to ice as Victoria's scent registered fully. Wolfsbane and something else. Something metallic and cold that made her wolf recoil in instinctive fear. But Mason was already moving toward his Luna, relief evident in his posture, as Victoria threw herself into his arms. I was so worried. Victoria breathed against his chest, her perfectly manicured hands clutching at his shirt. When I heard gunshots, when I couldn't find you, I'm fine, Mason assured her, his arms coming up automatically to hold her. We both are. Ruby watched the embrace with a familiar ache in her chest. But underneath the pain was something else. Suspicion. How had Victoria found them? Mason had said this was a secret safe house, hidden deep in pack territory where hunters couldn't track them. Yet Victoria had arrived within an hour of their escape, looking perfectly put together despite supposedly rushing through dangerous woods in the dark. How did you know where to find us? Ruby asked quietly. Victoria's blue eyes flicked to her over Mason's shoulder, and for just a moment, Ruby caught something cold and calculating there before it disappeared behind practiced concern. I know all of Mason's safe locations, Victoria said smoothly, stepping back from the embrace, but keeping one hand possessively on his arm. As Luna, it's my responsibility to be able to find him in emergencies. Ruby frowned. Even if Victoria knew the coordinates, reaching this cabin in less than an hour through twisting mountain roads should have been nearly impossible. Unless, of course, she hadn't come alone, and someone had cleared her path. It was a reasonable explanation. But something about Victoria's tone made Ruby's skin crawl. The woman was lying. Ruby was certain of it. But why? Victoria, how did you get away from the pack house safely? Mason asked, his alpha instincts finally kicking in. The hunters could still be out there. Oh, they're gone. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. Beta Jackson organized a patrol and drove them off. No casualties, thankfully, though several cars were damaged. Her gaze drifted meaningfully to Ruby. It seems they were specifically targeting someone. The accusation was subtle but clear. Ruby's presence had brought danger to the pack. Ruby bit back her defensive response, knowing it would only make things worse. The children are safe? Ruby asked instead. Perfectly fine, thanks to you. Victoria's smile was bright and empty, though I have to wonder what brought you back after all this time. It's not like you to risk yourself for a pack that you abandoned. Victoria. Mason's voice carried a warning that made his Luna's eyes flash. I'm simply concerned for everyone's safety, Victoria said innocently. These hunters seem very well informed about our pack's vulnerabilities, about who has healing abilities, when they might be called upon to help. It makes one wonder how they came by such specific intelligence. Ruby felt the blood drain from her face as the implication hit home. Victoria was suggesting that Ruby herself might be feeding information to the hunters. It was a clever manipulation, subtle enough that Mason might not catch it, but devastating enough to plant seeds of doubt. That's enough, Mason said sharply. Ruby risked her life to save those children. She deserves our gratitude, not suspicion. Victoria's hand tightened on his arm. Of course, darling. I didn't mean to imply. Yes, you did. Ruby had heard enough. She grabbed her medical bag from where she'd set it by the door. And message received. I should go. Ruby, wait. Mason stepped toward her, but Victoria's grip on his arm held him back. Perhaps that's for the best, Victoria said softly. For everyone's safety. The hunters might follow her scent trail here. Ruby stared at the woman who had stolen her life, her mate, her future. Victoria Crane stood there looking like the perfect Luna, beautiful, composed, protective of her pack. But Ruby could smell the wolfsbane clinging to her clothes, could see the cold calculation behind her concerned facade. You're right, Ruby said quietly. I should go. But first, she moved closer to Victoria, close enough to catch the full impact of her scent. You smell like wolfsbane, Victoria. Isn't that interesting? Victoria's eyes widened in what looked like genuine surprise. What? That's impossible. Is it? Ruby circled her slowly, like a predator scenting prey. Because I can smell it on your clothes, in your hair. The same wolfsbane compound that nearly killed 7 children. That's ridiculous, Victoria sputtered. But Ruby caught the slight tremor in her voice. I've been nowhere near wolfsbane. I don't even know what it smells like. Funny thing about wolfsbane, Ruby continued conversationally, it's hard to work with. Gets into everything, clothes, skin, hair. Takes days to completely wash out. And it has a very distinctive scent signature that healing-gifted individuals can detect. Mason's head snapped toward Victoria, his nostrils flaring as he tested her scent. Ruby watched his expression change from confusion to horror as he caught what Ruby had noticed immediately. Victoria. His voice was deadly quiet. Why do you smell like poison? I don't know what she's talking about, Victoria said quickly, backing toward the door. This is clearly some kind of mistake. Maybe I brushed against something in the woods. There's no wolfsbane in these woods, Mason interrupted, his alpha power beginning to radiate outward in waves. It doesn't grow naturally in this region. Someone would have to cultivate it deliberately. Victoria's mask was slipping, desperation creeping into her voice. Mason, you can't seriously believe... I can smell it too now, Mason said, his words falling like hammer blows. Wolfsbane. And something else. Something chemical. Synthetic. Ruby nodded grimly. The masking agent. Whoever made that poison knew what they were doing. They used something to hide the wolfsbane from casual detection, but they couldn't fool a trained healer. Victoria's blue eyes darted between them, and Ruby saw the moment she realized her deception was unraveling. The concerned Luna facade cracked, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. You don't understand, Victoria said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. I didn't have a choice. They have... She cut herself off abruptly, but it was too late. The admission hung in the air between them. They have what? Mason's voice was barely above a growl. Who has what, Victoria? Victoria straightened, some of her composure returning. It doesn't matter. What's done is done. You poisoned children, Ruby said quietly. 7 innocent children. They could have died, but they didn't, Victoria snapped, her mask falling away completely. You healed them, just like we knew you would. Just like you always do, playing the martyr, the selfless healer who can't resist helping anyone who needs it. The contempt in her voice was like a physical slap. Ruby staggered back, the full scope of the betrayal hitting her. You've been planning this. For how long? Victoria laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Years. Ever since I realized that Mason would never truly be mine as long as you existed. As long as he held on to some pathetic hope that you might come back. Mason made a sound like a wounded animal. Victoria, what have you done? What I had to do, Victoria said fiercely. The hunters offered me a deal. Your precious ruby in exchange for information about pack defenses. It was supposed to be clean, simple. They would take her, and our problem would be solved. Our problem? Mason's power lashed out, making the windows rattle. Ruby was never a problem. You made her one. Victoria's composure cracked further. She was always there, Mason. Even after you chose me, even after she left. She was always between us. You think I didn't notice how you looked at old photos of her? How you went quiet every time someone mentioned her name? Ruby felt sick. All those years of believing Mason had moved on, had been happy with his choice, and Victoria had been living with the same jealousy and insecurity that had eaten away at Ruby herself. So you made a deal with hunters, Ruby said numbly. You gave them information about the pack's healing resources, about me. I gave them what they wanted to know, Victoria said defiantly. That you had unusually strong healing abilities. That you would come running if pack children were in danger. That was all. That was enough, Mason growled. More than enough to get people killed. No one was supposed to die. Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. The poison was carefully measured. The children would get sick enough to bring Ruby back, but not sick enough to actually die. It was supposed to be controlled. And the hunters attacked tonight? Ruby asked. Was that controlled too? Victoria went silent, her face pale. They were supposed to take you quietly, she whispered finally, during the chaos at the pack house. But you escaped too quickly, and Mason... She looked at him with something like regret. You weren't supposed to be with her. You were supposed to be dealing with pack security while they took her away. The betrayal was complete. Ruby felt hollow, scooped out by the magnitude of what Victoria had done. Not just the poisoning, not just the hunters, but the systematic destruction of everything Ruby had once called home. Where are they now? Mason asked, his voice deadly calm. The hunters. Where are they waiting? Victoria's eyes darted toward the window. I don't... A red laser dot appeared on the glass behind her, and Ruby's blood turned to ice. They're here, she breathed. Mason was already moving, tackling both women to the floor as the window exploded inward in a hail of gunfire. But as they hit the ground, Ruby caught Victoria's expression. Not surprise or fear, but grim satisfaction. The woman had led the hunters right to them, and now they were trapped. Chapter 5. Blood and Betrayal. Gunfire erupted through the cabin like deadly fireworks, splintering wood and shattering glass as Mason shielded Ruby with his body. Victoria rolled away from them, pressing herself against the wall with practiced ease. Too practiced, Ruby realized with sickening clarity. The woman had known exactly what to expect. Stay down, Mason growled, his eyes already beginning to glow with the golden light that preceded a shift. Ruby, can you get to the back bedroom? Before Ruby could answer, the front door exploded inward. 3 figures in tactical gear poured through, assault rifles raised and ready. Their faces were hidden behind night vision goggles, but their movements were coordinated, professional. Mason was shifting even as the first hunter cleared the doorway. His human form blurred and expanded, bones cracking and reforming as his wolf burst free. 8 feet of pure alpha fury landed on the lead hunter, massive jaws clamping down on the man's arm before he could fire. The hunter's scream was cut short as Mason's teeth found his throat. Ruby scrambled toward the hallway, her medical bag clutched against her chest. But the second hunter was already tracking her movement, finger tightening on the trigger. Don't shoot her, you idiot! Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. She's worth more alive. The hunter hesitated for a split second, long enough for Mason to tear free from his first victim and launch himself across the room. But the third hunter was ready, a tranquilizer gun already aimed at the massive black wolf. The dart caught Mason in the shoulder. He stumbled, shaking his great head as the drug took hold, but his alpha strength fought the sedative. With a snarl of pure rage, he charged the third hunter. Ruby used the distraction to reach the bedroom, slamming the door behind her and frantically looking for another exit. The window was too small, the walls too thick. She was trapped. Heavy footsteps approached the door. Ruby pressed herself against the far wall, her healing abilities useless against bullets and tranquilizer darts. She could hear Mason fighting in the main room, growls and shouts and the sound of furniture being destroyed. The door handle turned. Ruby closed her eyes, thinking of the children she'd saved, of Mason's desperate confession, of all the things she'd never get to say or do. At least the kids were safe. At least she'd managed to heal them before. Ruby. Victoria's voice was soft, almost gentle. Come out. It's over. Ruby opened her eyes to find Victoria standing in the doorway. No longer the polished Luna, but something harder, more dangerous. Her blonde hair was disheveled, her designer clothes torn, but her eyes were bright with triumph. Where's Mason? Ruby demanded. Tranquilized. Don't worry, he's not dead. The hunters need him alive to keep the pack from retaliating. Victoria stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Though I can't guarantee he'll stay that way if you don't cooperate. Ruby's wolf snarled beneath her skin, desperate to shift and fight. But she was an Omega, bred for healing rather than battle. Against trained hunters and whatever Victoria had become, she wouldn't stand a chance. What do you want? Ruby asked. Victoria laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. What I've always wanted, for you to disappear. Permanently this time. The hunters want your healing abilities for their experiments. Something about weaponizing supernatural gifts. Victoria shrugged as if discussing the weather. They've been very generous with their payments for information. Ruby felt sick. How long? How long have you been working with them? Since before I even arrived at Riverside Pack. Victoria's mask fell away completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Did you really think it was coincidence? A lone Omega refugee with a tragic backstory, arriving just months before the Alpha's choosing ceremony? Her eyes flickered, and for a heartbeat Ruby glimpsed something raw beneath the cold confession. A trace of jealousy, of longing, of a woman who had played her role so well she had almost started to believe it herself. The room spun around Ruby. You were never a refugee. My pack was never destroyed. I volunteered for this assignment because the payment was too good to refuse, and because taking down an Alpha's mate was considered a significant achievement in certain circles. Ruby's mind raced, pieces of a horrifying puzzle falling into place. You've been feeding them information for years. About pack defenses, about individual abilities, about everything. Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. Patrol schedules, safe house locations, the identities of pack members with useful gifts. The hunters have been very patient, building their database, waiting for the right moment to strike. The children. You could have killed them. Victoria's expression flickered. The first sign of genuine emotion Ruby had seen. That wasn't supposed to happen. The dosage was carefully calculated. But children metabolize toxins differently than adults, and several of them nearly... She shook her head. It doesn't matter. They survived. Because I healed them. Because I'm exactly the kind of person who can't let children die. Even children from a pack that cast me out. Ruby's voice was hollow. You knew I'd come. I knew Mason would call you. I knew his guilt over choosing me would make him desperate enough to reach out. And I knew you'd never be able to resist playing the martyr. Victoria pulled a syringe from her jacket pocket, the needle gleaming in the dim light. It was really quite predictable. Ruby eyed the syringe warily. What is that? Something to keep you compliant during transport. The hunters prefer their subjects conscious but manageable. Victoria stepped closer. Don't worry. I'm told the experiments are only moderately painful. Most subjects survive the initial phase. Most? Ruby's voice cracked. Well, healing abilities are so rare. The researchers need multiple test subjects to establish proper baselines. Victoria's tone was conversational, as if she were discussing grocery shopping. Your tissue samples alone should keep them busy for months. The casual cruelty was worse than outright malice. Ruby stared at the woman who had shared Mason's bed for 3 years, who had stood beside him at pack gatherings, who had been accepted as Luna by people Ruby had grown up with. You're a monster, Ruby whispered. I'm practical. Victoria raised the syringe. Hold still. Fighting will only make this more difficult. Ruby tensed, preparing to run or fight or do something, anything, to avoid that needle. But before she could move, a sound reached them through the cabin walls. Howls. Deep, powerful, unmistakably alpha. Victoria frowned. That's impossible. The tranquilizer should have kept him unconscious for hours. The howls grew closer, joined by others. A pack responding to their alpha's call for help. Ruby's heart leaped with hope, even as Victoria's face twisted with rage. "No," Victoria snarled. "I won't let you ruin this. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much." She lunged forward with the syringe. Ruby threw herself sideways, crashing into the nightstand as the needle passed inches from her throat. Victoria cursed, regaining her balance and advancing again. "You should have stayed away," Victoria hissed. "You should have left us alone. Mason was finally starting to forget you, finally beginning to accept what we had. But you couldn't let that happen, could you? You had to come back and remind him of everything he thought he'd lost." Ruby scrambled backward, using the bed as a barrier. "He never forgot me. That's what's been eating at you all these years, isn't it? You could have his body, his title, his loyalty, but you never had his heart." Victoria's composure shattered completely. "Shut up. I gave him everything. I was the perfect Luna, the perfect mate. I supported his decisions, defended his leadership, stood by him through every crisis. And for what? So he could dream about some pathetic Omega who abandoned him? I never abandoned him," Ruby said quietly. "He abandoned me when he chose you over everything we'd built together, over everything we'd promised each other." "Promises?" Victoria laughed wildly. "What promises? You were children playing at love. I gave him real partnership, real devotion." The bedroom window exploded inward as a massive black shape crashed through it. Mason in full wolf form, his golden eyes blazing with fury, blood matting his fur, where the tranquilizer dart had struck. Victoria spun around, the syringe still clutched in her hand. "You should be unconscious." Mason's lips pulled back from fangs that gleamed white in the darkness. When he spoke, his voice was distorted by the partial shift, more growl than words. "Alpha blood burns through chemicals faster than you know. It wasn't the first time. As alpha, his metabolism had adapted to centuries of predators and poisons alike. What could kill an ordinary wolf in minutes only slowed him, his body burning through the toxin with sheer feral will. He launched himself at Victoria, but she was already moving. The syringe flew from her hand as she dove toward the door, screaming for the hunters. "Kill them both. The deal's off. Kill them both." Mason landed where Victoria had been standing, his massive head swinging toward Ruby. For a moment their eyes met, human green and wolf gold, and Ruby saw everything he'd been trying to tell her. Love, regret, desperate hope, and a promise that this time he would choose her. This time he would choose right. Gunfire erupted from the main room as the remaining hunters responded to Victoria's screams. Mason's form blurred back toward human, his need to protect Ruby overriding his wolf's desire to hunt down the traitor who had nearly destroyed everything he cared about. "Can you climb?" he asked urgently, gesturing toward the broken window. Ruby nodded, adrenaline giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. Behind them, Victoria's voice rose in a desperate litany of orders and threats. But it was too late. The cavalry had arrived. As Ruby and Mason escaped through the window, the cabin erupted in the sounds of battle. Pack wolves against human hunters, loyalty against betrayal, love against the cold calculation that had nearly torn them all apart. The war for their survival had begun. Chapter 6: Fire and Redemption. The forest erupted in chaos around them as Ruby and Mason crashed through the underbrush, the sounds of battle echoing behind them. Pack wolves had arrived in force, their howls splitting the night as they engaged the hunters in deadly combat. But Ruby could hear Victoria's voice rising above it all, directing the remaining mercenaries with cold precision. Mason's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers interlacing with hers as they ran. Even in human form, his alpha strength pulled her forward when her legs threatened to give out. Blood streamed from a dozen cuts where broken glass had sliced through his clothes, but he showed no signs of slowing. "There's another safe house," he panted, his voice rough from the partial shift. 2 miles north. We can... A rifle crack split the air, and bark exploded from the tree beside Ruby's head. She threw herself sideways, dragging Mason with her as more shots rang out. Through the trees, she could see muzzle flashes. At least 3 hunters had broken away from the main battle to pursue them. "They're hurting us," Mason realized, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead, pushing us toward something. Ruby's blood chilled as she caught a familiar scent on the wind. Victoria. She's out there waiting. Mason's expression hardened. Then we give her what she's waiting for. Before Ruby could ask what he meant, Mason was shifting again. But this time, he didn't complete the transformation. Instead, he held himself in that dangerous space between human and wolf, enhanced strength and speed, but with human intelligence and the ability to speak. "Stay behind me," he growled, his voice distorted but understandable. "Whatever happens, Ruby, I need you to know." "Don't." Ruby's hand found his face, her fingers tracing the sharp angles that were more pronounced in his partial shift. "Don't say goodbye." Not again. Mason's golden eyes met hers, and she saw everything there. Love, regret, determination, and a desperate need to protect her no matter the cost. "I love you," he said simply. "I've loved you since we were children. I never stopped, not for a single day." Ruby's heart clenched. "Mason, I chose wrong before. I was scared, and I let politics and duty cloud my judgment. But if we survive this, if we make it through tonight," his hand covered hers where it rested against his cheek. "Choose me back, Ruby. Give us another chance." Before she could answer, the hunters closed in. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their movements coordinated and deadly. But these weren't the armored mercenaries from the cabin. These men moved with supernatural grace, their eyes reflecting light in the darkness. "Enhanced humans," Mason snarled. "Victoria's been busy." The first hunter launched himself at Mason with inhuman speed. They collided in a tangle of claws and fists, rolling across the forest floor in a deadly embrace. The second hunter circled wide, trying to flank them, while the third raised a weapon Ruby didn't recognize, something that hummed with electric energy. Ruby pressed herself against a massive oak, her medical bag clutched to her chest. She had no weapons, no way to fight creatures that were faster and stronger than normal humans. But as she watched Mason grapple with his opponent, she realized she did have something. Her healing abilities weren't just for mending wounds. They could also cause them. The thought came to her like a revelation. If she could accelerate healing, could she reverse the process? Could she turn her gift into a weapon? The third hunter aimed his strange device at Mason, finger tightening on the trigger. Ruby didn't think. She just moved. Her hands found the hunter's throat as he fired, and she poured her power into him. But instead of healing energy, she pushed something else. Cellular breakdown. The rapid decay that was the opposite of regeneration. The hunter screamed, dropping his weapon as his skin began to burn under her touch. He clawed at her hands, but Ruby held on, horrified and fascinated by what she was doing. The man's enhanced strength meant nothing against the cellular destruction coursing through his system. "Ruby!" Mason's warning came too late. The second hunter had circled behind her while she was focused on his partner. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet and away from her victim. She kicked and struggled, but the enhanced human's grip was like iron. "Valuable little healer," the hunter purred in her ear, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "The researchers will be very interested in your offensive capabilities." Ruby drove her elbow back into his ribs, feeling something crack. The hunter grunted but didn't release her. Instead, he began dragging her deeper into the forest, away from Mason's desperate battle. "Let her go." Victoria's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Ruby's captor stopped, confusion evident in his posture. "Ma'am?" Victoria stepped into view, no longer the polished Luna but something far more dangerous. Her designer clothes were torn and bloody, her perfect hair tangled with leaves and debris. But her eyes burned with an intensity that made Ruby's skin crawl. "I said let her go." Victoria's voice carried an authority that made the enhanced human's grip loosen involuntarily. "She's mine to deal with. The contract specified live capture. The contract is void." Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Change of plans," The hunter released Ruby so suddenly she stumbled, catching herself against a tree. Behind them, she could hear Mason finishing his fight. The wet sound of claws finding flesh, a gurgled scream that cut off abruptly. "Victoria," Ruby said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "Whatever you're planning." "What I'm planning." Victoria laughed, the sound echoing through the trees. "I'm not planning anything anymore, Ruby. I'm improvising. And do you know what I've realized?" Ruby remained silent, her mind racing as she calculated distances and escape routes. Mason was too far away, still dealing with the aftermath of his battle. She was alone with a woman who had already proven she was willing to kill children to achieve her goals. "I've realized that I can't compete with a ghost," Victoria continued, pulling a knife from her jacket. The blade gleamed in the moonlight, its edge razor-sharp. "For 3 years, I've tried to make Mason forget you. I've been the perfect Luna, the perfect mate, the perfect political alliance. But it was never enough, was it? Victoria, you don't have to, don't I?" Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. "Do you have any idea what it's been like? Sharing his bed while knowing he dreams of you? Hearing him say my name but knowing he's thinking of yours? Watching him go through the motions of loving me while his heart was always somewhere else?" Ruby's back hit another tree as Victoria advanced, the knife held low and ready. "That wasn't my choice. I left. I stayed away for 3 years. But you came back." Victoria's mask of control finally shattered completely. "You couldn't just stay gone, could you? You had to come back and remind him of everything he thought he'd lost. Well, I won't let you destroy what I've built. I won't let you take him from me again." She lunged forward with the blade. Ruby threw herself sideways, feeling the knife part the air where her throat had been. Victoria was fast, faster than Ruby had expected, already spinning to follow up with another strike. Ruby's healing training kicked in. Not the mystical energy work, but the practical medical knowledge that included anatomy and vulnerable points. She grabbed Victoria's wrist, twisting hard to redirect the knife away from her body. Ruby had never been trained as a warrior, but years of medical practice had given her a precise knowledge of anatomy, where to strike, where to twist, how to use leverage when strength failed. Fear lent her speed, and desperation gave her power she didn't know she possessed. They grappled in the darkness, both women fighting with the desperation of those who had everything to lose. Victoria was stronger, better trained, but Ruby had the advantage of desperation and the knowledge that Mason was fighting his way toward them. The knife scored across Ruby's shoulder, sending fire through her arm. She gasped, her grip loosening just enough for Victoria to tear free. "You should have stayed away," Victoria panted, raising the blade again. "You should have let us be happy." "Were you happy?" Ruby asked, genuinely curious despite the knife pointed at her heart. "Really? Because from where I stood, it looked like you were both just going through the motions." Victoria's face twisted with rage and something that might have been grief. "We could have been. If you'd just stayed away. If you'd just let him go." "I did let him go." Ruby's voice was quiet, certain. 3 years ago, when he chose you, I let him go completely. I built a new life, found a new purpose. I didn't come back for him, Victoria. I came back for 7 dying children. Liar. I'm not lying. Ask yourself. If I'd wanted Mason back, wouldn't I have fought for him 3 years ago? Wouldn't I have stayed and tried to change his mind instead of disappearing without a word? Victoria's hand trembled, the knife wavering slightly. "You're trying to confuse me. I'm trying to tell you the truth. The Mason you fell in love with, the one who chose you as his Luna, he was never really yours to begin with. Not because of me, but because he was broken. Because he chose duty over his heart, and it poisoned everything he touched." Victoria's composure cracked further. "Stop. He would have been miserable with me too if he'd chosen me for the wrong reasons. Love isn't about possession, Victoria. It's about choice. Free choice, made without coercion or guilt or political pressure." "Shut up!" Victoria raised the knife above her head, prepared to bring it down in a killing stroke. But before she could strike, a massive black shape crashed into her from the side. Mason in full wolf form, his golden eyes blazing with protective fury. Victoria flew backward. the knife spinning away into the darkness as she hit the ground hard. Mason shifted back to human form, blood streaming from multiple wounds, but his attention focused entirely on Ruby. "Are you hurt?" Ruby nodded toward her injured shoulder. "Nothing I can't heal." Mason's hands were gentle as he examined the cut, his touch sending familiar warmth through her despite the pain. "I'm sorry. I should have been faster." "You were fast enough." Ruby caught his face in her hands, studying the cuts and bruises that marked his skin. "Let me heal you." "Ruby, let me heal you," she insisted. "Please." Mason nodded, going still as her healing energy flowed between them. The warmth that had always existed between them intensified, becoming something deeper, more profound. Not just physical healing, but the mending of 3 years of broken trust and wounded hearts. A soft groan reminded them that Victoria was still conscious. She lay crumpled against a fallen log, her perfect hair matted with blood, her designer clothes torn beyond repair. But her eyes were still sharp, still calculating. "It's not over," she whispered. "Even if you kill me, it's not over. The hunters know about you now, about what you can do. They'll never stop coming." Mason's expression hardened. "Then we'll be ready for them." Victoria's laugh was broken, defeated. "Will you? When they come for your children? When they poison your water supply, your food stores? When they turn your own pack members against you with lies and bribes and threats?" Ruby felt Mason tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. "Why?" she asked Victoria. "Why did you really do this?" "It wasn't just about Mason, was it?" Victoria's mask slipped one final time, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "My real pack was destroyed. Not by enemies or rival alphas, but by hunters. They experimented on us, tortured us, turned us into weapons. I was the only one who escaped, and only because I agreed to work for them." The confession hung in the air between them, changing everything. Ruby felt her anger drain away, replaced by something closer to pity. "They have leverage over you," she realized. "Other survivors, people you care about." Victoria nodded weakly. "My younger sister, my parents. They're alive, but only as long as I deliver what the hunters want. I thought if I gave them you, they'd finally let my family go." Mason's expression softened fractionally. "Victoria, don't." Victoria struggled to sit up, wincing at the movement. "Don't you dare pity me. I made my choices. I poisoned children, betrayed the pack that took me in, tried to murder the woman you love. I don't deserve forgiveness." Ruby looked at this broken woman who had caused so much pain and felt something shift inside her chest. "Maybe not. But you deserve a chance to make things right." Victoria stared at her in shock. "What?" "Help us," Ruby said simply. "Tell us everything you know about the hunters' operations, their plans, their weaknesses. Help us save your family and stop them from hurting anyone else." Mason's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with hers in silent support. Whatever choice Ruby made, he would stand behind her. Victoria's eyes filled with tears for the first time since Ruby had known her. "Why would you trust me? After everything I've done?" Ruby smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. Even you. Even us." As dawn broke through the trees, the 3 of them sat in the forest clearing and began planning how to take down the organization that had manipulated them all. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be more battles to come. But for the first time in 3 years, Ruby felt hope blooming in her chest. She had her healing gift, her strength, and most importantly, she had Mason beside her, not because of duty or politics or desperation, but because they had chosen each other freely. Chapter 7. Chosen Hearts. 2 weeks after the battle in the forest, Ruby stood before the Pack Council, her hands steady despite the weight of what she was about to do. The great hall of the Riverside Pack House had been restored after the hunter attack, its wooden beams gleaming under soft lighting that made the gathered pack members look like they were participating in something sacred, which Ruby supposed they were. Mason sat at the head of the council table, no longer just the alpha who had made a desperate political choice 3 years ago, but a leader who had fought for his people, his territory, and the woman he loved. The scars from his battle with the hunters were still visible on his hands and face, but they only served to emphasize the strength that had always been there. Victoria sat in the defendant's chair, her wrists bound with silver chains that prevented her from shifting. But she was no longer the broken woman who had tried to murder Ruby in the forest. Over the past 2 weeks, as she had shared everything she knew about the Hunter organization, a different person had emerged. Someone who had made terrible choices but was trying to atone for them. Victoria Crane, Elder Morrison intoned, his weathered face grave. You stand accused of treason against the Riverside Pack, conspiracy with enemies of our kind, and the attempted murder of pack members. How do you answer these charges? Victoria straightened her shoulders, meeting the elder's gaze without flinching. Guilty on all counts. A murmur ran through the assembled pack members. Ruby could smell their emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and underneath it all, a grudging respect for Victoria's honesty. The penalty for treason is death, Elder Morrison continued. However, Alpha Hayes has requested that we consider the circumstances of your actions and the cooperation you have provided in dismantling the Hunter network. Do you wish to speak in your own defense? Victoria glanced at Mason, then at Ruby, before addressing the council. I don't ask for forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. I poisoned children, betrayed people who trusted me, and nearly destroyed the pack that gave me shelter when I needed it most. Her voice was steady, but Ruby could see the pain in her eyes. I only ask that you remember that the Hunter organization is still out there. They have other operatives, other plans. My death won't stop them. But the intelligence I've provided might. Elder Chen leaned forward. You would have us show mercy to spare your family? I would have you show mercy because it's the right thing to do. Victoria replied quietly. Because this pack is better than the organization that shaped me. Because Alpha Hayes and Ruby Winters have shown me what real strength looks like. The kind that protects rather than destroys. Ruby stepped forward, drawing all eyes to her. She had asked for the right to speak on Victoria's behalf, knowing it would be controversial, but feeling it was necessary. 3 years ago, I left this pack because I believed there was no place for me here, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. I was wrong. Not because circumstances have changed, but because I finally understand what it means to belong somewhere. She looked directly at Mason, seeing love and encouragement in his blue eyes. Belonging isn't about blood or tradition or political convenience. It's about choice. About deciding to stand with people even when it's difficult, even when they've hurt you, even when forgiveness seems impossible. Ruby turned to face Victoria. Victoria made terrible choices, but they came from a place of desperation and manipulation. She was a victim before she became a perpetrator, and in the end, when it mattered most, she chose to help us rather than destroy us. She tried to kill you, Beta Jackson pointed out harshly. She would have succeeded if the Alpha hadn't intervened. Yes, Ruby agreed. She would have. But that same desperation, that same fierce loyalty to the people she loves, that's what we need to fight the Hunters. Not her death, but her knowledge, her connections, her inside understanding of how they operate. Mason stood, his Alpha presence filling the room. I've spoken with the Council of Alphas from the surrounding territories. The Hunter organization has been active across multiple states, targeting gifters and healers specifically. Victoria's intelligence has already helped us shut down 3 of their research facilities and rescue dozens of captives. He walked around the table to stand beside Ruby, his hand finding hers in a gesture of solidarity that sent warmth through her entire body. I propose exile rather than execution. Victoria will be stripped of her Luna status and banished from Pact territory, but she'll be free to continue working with federal authorities to dismantle the Hunter network. The Pack members exchanged glances, weighing justice against practicality. Finally, Elder Morrison called for a vote. It was close, closer than Ruby had hoped, but Mercy won by 3 votes. Victoria closed her eyes in relief, tears streaming down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank us yet, Mason said seriously. Exile means you can never return to Pack territory. You'll be alone, without the protection or support of a Pack family. It's a hard life, Victoria nodded. Harder than I deserve, but easier than death. I'll make the most of it. As the silver chains were removed from her wrists, Victoria looked at Ruby one final time. I'm sorry, she said simply, for everything. I hope you'll be happy. Ruby surprised herself by stepping forward and embracing the woman who had tried to destroy her. I hope you'll find peace, she replied. Real peace, not the kind that comes from possession or control. Victoria was escorted from the hall by pack guards who would see her safely to the territory boundary. Ruby watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure. Not forgiveness exactly, but something like understanding. Now, Elder Morrison said, his voice taking on a more ceremonial tone. We come to the matter of the Alpha's choice of Luna. Ruby's heart stopped. She looked at Mason in surprise, but he was smiling. The first genuine, unguarded smile she'd seen from him in years. 3 years ago, I made a choice based on fear and political pressure, Mason said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. I chose someone I thought would be safe, practical, beneficial to the pack's standing. I was wrong. Not because Victoria turned out to be a traitor, but because I ignored the most important factor in choosing a mate. He turned to face Ruby fully, taking both her hands in his. Love. Real love. The kind that makes you better, stronger, more than you ever thought you could be alone. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes as Mason dropped to one knee before her, there in front of the entire pack. Ruby Winters, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You are my heart. You always have been, since we were children playing in these very halls. You are my strength, my conscience, my better half. I should have chosen you 3 years ago. Should have had the courage to follow my heart instead of my fears. He pulled a simple silver ring from his pocket. Not the ornate Luna circlet that Victoria had worn, but something personal, meaningful. Ruby recognized it as the promise ring he'd given her when they were teenagers, the one she'd left behind when she fled the pack. I can't undo the mistakes I've made, Mason continued, but I can choose better going forward. Will you be my Luna, my mate, my partner in all things? Will you choose me back, Ruby? Ruby looked down at the man kneeling before her, then at the faces of the pack members surrounding them. These people had watched her grow up, had seen her leave in heartbreak, had welcomed her back when they needed her skills. Some looked skeptical, others hopeful, but all of them were waiting for her answer. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with joy. Yes, I choose you. I choose us. I choose this pack and this life and this chance to build something real together. Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to kiss her deeply as the hall erupted in cheers and applause. Ruby kissed him back with 3 years of pent-up longing, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized she was crying. When they finally broke apart, Elder Morrison was beaming. Then by the authority vested in me by pack law and moon goddess tradition, I pronounce you Alpha and Luna of the Riverside Pack. May your bond be strong, your leadership wise, and your love enduring. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Pack members who had been hesitant to accept Ruby initially found themselves won over by her genuine warmth and the obvious happiness she brought to their Alpha. Children who remembered her healing them weeks earlier brought her drawings and flowers. Elder wolves shared stories of her parents, who had been beloved members of the pack before their deaths. Ruby felt overwhelmed by the acceptance, by the sense of belonging she had never quite achieved before. This wasn't just Mason choosing her. This was an entire community welcoming her home. Later, as the celebration wound down, Ruby and Mason found themselves alone on the back porch of the pack house, looking out over the territory that was now theirs to protect. Any regrets? Mason asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the moon rise over the forest. Ruby considered the question seriously. About Victoria? About the hunters? About the children who were hurt because of choices neither of us made? About us. About choosing this life. Ruby turned in his arms, studying his face in the moonlight. He looked older than he had 3 years ago, marked by leadership and responsibility, and the weight of difficult decisions. But his eyes still held the same warmth that had captured her heart when they were children. No regrets, she said firmly. We both had to grow into the people we are now. We had to learn what love really means, what it costs, what it's worth. 3 years ago, we weren't ready for this. Now we are. Mason smiled, leaning down to rest his forehead against hers. I love you, Luna. Ruby's heart swelled at the title, not because of the power or status it represented, but because of the partnership it promised. I love you too, Alpha. As they kissed under the full moon, Ruby felt her healing abilities stir, not to mend wounds or fight toxins, but simply to celebrate the joy flowing between them. Around them, the pack territory settled into peaceful sleep, protected by leaders who had chosen each other freely and would guard their people with everything they had. The hunter threat wasn't gone, might never be completely gone, but they would face it together, as partners, as mates, as the Alpha and Luna the Riverside Pack deserved. Ruby had finally found her way home. Chapter 8. Coming Home. 6 months later, Ruby woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of the master bedroom she now shared with Mason, and the sensation of tiny feet kicking against her ribs. She placed a protective hand over her rounded belly, marveling at how much her life had changed since that desperate phone call that had brought her back to the pack. Good morning, little ones, she murmured to the twins growing inside her. At 4 months along, they were already active, as if eager to join the world that awaited them. Mason stirred beside her, his arm tightening around her waist as he nuzzled into her neck. How are they today? Restless. Like their father. Ruby smiled as she felt his lips curve against her skin. I think they're going to be trouble. The best kind of trouble, Mason said, his hand joining hers on her belly. Strong and stubborn and absolutely perfect. Ruby turned in his arms, studying his face in the morning light. The stress lines that had marked him during the hunter crisis had softened, replaced by the contentment of a man who had found his purpose. Leading the pack alongside her felt natural in a way his previous arrangement with Victoria never had. The medical center opens today, she said, excitement threading through her voice. Mason's smile was full of pride. Luna Ruby Winters Hayes' Interpack Healing Center. Has a nice ring to it. Ruby had spent the past 6 months working with pack leaders from across the state to establish a neutral medical facility where any shifter could receive care, regardless of pack affiliation or political tensions. It had been her dream project, combining her veterinary training with her healing abilities to serve the broader supernatural community. Dr. Martinez arrives this afternoon to oversee the surgical wing, Ruby continued, then paused as a familiar scent reached her. And it looks like we have a visitor. Mason's expression grew cautious as he caught the scent too. She wasn't supposed to return for another month. A soft knock on their bedroom door preceded Victoria's voice. Alpha? Luna? I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's news. Ruby and Mason exchanged glances. Victoria's exile had technically ended 3 months ago after she'd successfully helped federal authorities dismantle the last known hunter research facility. Rather than return to pack territory permanently, she had chosen to work as a liaison between the supernatural community and human law enforcement, a role that kept her traveling, but allowed her to use her experience for good. Come in, Victoria, Ruby called. Victoria entered, looking healthier than Ruby had seen her in years. Exile had been difficult, but it had also freed her from the desperate need to maintain a perfect facade. Her blonde hair was shorter now, practical rather than styled, and she wore simple clothes that spoke of function over fashion. I apologize for the early hour, Victoria said, genuine regret in her voice. But I wanted to tell you personally before you heard it from official channels. Mason sat up straighter. What happened? We found them, Victoria said simply. My family. My real family. They're alive, and they're free. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes as she saw the relief and joy on Victoria's face. Victoria, that's wonderful. The final hunter facility was hidden in Alaska. Victoria continued, her voice thick with emotion. My parents, my sister, 17 other survivors. They'd been held there for over a decade. The experiments, the conditioning, everything the hunters did to them. She paused, composing herself. It's going to take time for them to heal, but they're safe now. Mason leaned forward. Do you need pack support? Medical resources? Victoria's smile was grateful, but sad. Thank you, but they're in good hands. The government has a specialized rehabilitation program for supernatural trauma survivors. And honestly, I think they need time to remember who they were before the hunters twisted them into weapons. Ruby understood. Victoria's family had been through horrors that would take years to process. They needed professional help, not well-meaning pack intervention. "What will you do now?" Ruby asked. "Keep working with law enforcement. There are always new threats, new organizations trying to exploit supernatural individuals." Victoria paused, looking uncertain for the first time since entering. "But I wanted to ask, when the medical center holds its dedication ceremony, would it be appropriate for me to attend? I know my presence might be uncomfortable for some pack members." Ruby looked at Mason, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Victoria's information had been crucial in stopping the hunters, and her work continued to protect other supernaturals from similar fates. More importantly, she had genuinely changed from the desperate, manipulative woman who had poisoned children to get what she wanted. "You should be there," Ruby said firmly. "You're part of this story, Victoria. Part of what made the medical center possible. The pack needs to see that redemption is real, that people can change." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," Ruby replied honestly, "but you've earned a chance to keep making amends. That's worth something." After Victoria left to continue her work, Ruby and Mason prepared for the day ahead. The medical center's opening was a significant milestone, not just for Ruby personally, but for the entire supernatural community. For the first time, shifters from rival packs would have a place to receive care without political complications. The dedication ceremony drew representatives from 12 different packs, as well as federal officials and human medical professionals who had been cleared to work with supernatural patients. Ruby stood at the podium, her hand resting on her belly as she looked out at the crowd gathered in the center's main lobby. "3 years ago, I thought my life was over," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the space. "I had lost my pack, my purpose, my sense of belonging. But sometimes what feels like an ending is actually the beginning of something better." She found Mason in the crowd, standing with the pack elders and beaming with pride. Beside him, the 7 children she had healed sat with their families, healthy and strong, and serving as living proof of what her abilities could accomplish. "This medical center represents more than healing," Ruby continued. "It represents hope. Hope that our communities can work together, that old rivalries can be set aside for the greater good, that no one should suffer simply because they don't have access to appropriate care." The applause was thunderous, but Ruby's attention was caught by a familiar figure at the back of the room. Victoria had arrived as promised, dressed simply but appropriately, her presence causing some murmurs, but no open hostility. Progress, Ruby thought. Not perfect, but progress. Dr. Martinez, the human physician who would head the surgical department, spoke next about the groundbreaking research opportunities the center would provide. Several pack leaders offered their support and resources. But the moment that moved Ruby most was when little Emma Morrison, one of the children she had saved from wolfsbane poisoning, presented her with a drawing. "It's you and Alpha Mason and your babies," Emma explained solemnly, "and all of us being safe and happy." The drawing was crude but heartfelt, stick figures with big smiles standing in front of a building labeled Healing Place. Ruby accepted it with tears in her eyes, knowing it would have a place of honor in her office. As the ceremony wound down and guests began touring the facility, Ruby found herself in the quiet of her new office, looking out at the forest that surrounded the medical center. Mason appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Penny for your thoughts?" he said, settling into the chair beside her desk. Ruby accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling the calming blend of chamomile and honey. "I was thinking about second chances, about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing. Any regrets about the path we took to get here?" Ruby considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had been challenging, rebuilding trust with the pack, establishing the medical center, dealing with the ongoing hunter investigations, and navigating pregnancy while taking on the responsibilities of being Luna. "No regrets," she said finally. "Every choice, every mistake, every moment of pain, it all led us here, to this life, this love, this chance to make a real difference. Mason reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. I love you, Luna. Today, tomorrow, and for the rest of our very long lives. I love you too, Alpha, Ruby replied, feeling the twins shift restlessly as if responding to their parents' voices. All of you. As afternoon turned to evening and the medical center settled into quiet readiness for its first patients, Ruby and Mason returned to the pack house hand in hand. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and joys, responsibilities and rewards, but faced together as true partners. Ruby had finally found her home, not in a place or a title, but in the choice to love and be loved completely. The girl who had once believed she was unwanted, unworthy, had become a woman who knew her own value and chose to share it freely with the world. The scent of jasmine and heartbreak that had haunted her for so long was finally gone, replaced by something infinitely sweeter. The perfume of new beginnings, of love freely given and gratefully received, of a life built on choices made with an open heart. Under the light of the full moon, Alpha Mason Hayes and Luna Ruby Winters Hayes settled into their shared bed, surrounded by the pack they protected and the future they were building together. In 6 months, their twins would arrive to add their voices to the song of home Ruby had thought she'd lost forever, but she had never lost it. She had simply been waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right choice to bring her back to where she belonged. In Mason's arms, with their children growing inside her and their pack sleeping safely around them, Ruby had never been more certain of anything in her life. She was exactly where she was meant to be,